Justification is always an attempt to hold on to someone else's love. Why do we feel such a rush to explain who we are? What if this habit, seemingly harmless, is actually an elegant form of submission? What happens if you simply stop justifying yourself? As Carl Jung said, what you resist persists. Most of our explanations are just excuses in disguise. Friedrich Nietzsche. Loneliness is not the absence of others, it is the absence of yourself. And Clarice Lispector. Have you ever tried to say no without explanations? Have you dared to feel sadness without covering it with a social smile? Have you held back the urge to explain your absence, your change of mood, your silence? It feels like something tightens in your chest, doesn't it? An almost physical discomfort, as if we're committing a crime merely by existing without permission. From childhood, it's been subtly suggested that our worth depends on being understood by others, that we have the right to feel only if we're gotten, that we can exist only if we explain everything. But what if I tell you that's a prison with invisible bars, where the key to freedom is not convincing others, but stopping the attempt? Carl Gustav Jung, a cartographer of the soul, warned, "The compulsive urge to justify yourself isn't kindness. It's a symptom, a wound, the absence of self. It's proof that we live for acceptance, not for wholeness." This video isn't a self-help manual, it's a mirror. Dark but necessary. In it, you may recognize the face of your daily surrender, the one that happens every time you say, "Sorry, I'm just like this." Every time you try to seem reasonable just so you won't be rejected. Today we'll descend into the psyche's dark basement. We'll light a candle where the ego tries to be liked, and the true self is silent. And perhaps, just perhaps, you'll discover what happens when you stop explaining yourself. They don't teach this at school, but there is a quiet theater that governs much of human relating. A theater whose script is always the same. Please, understand me. It's subtle, almost elegant. You say, "Sorry if I was sharp, I had a hard day." Or, "I'm not being weird, I'm just a bit tired." But what's really behind all those explanations? When we justify ourselves, it's not a simple reporting of facts. Deep down, we're begging, "Don't reject me for who I am." And it goes deeper than it seems. Jung saw in such behavior a direct reflection of a rupture with the self. Whoever feels compelled to explain is already betraying themselves. Think about it. Does a person who lives in their truth need anyone's sanction in order to exist? Constant explanations are a plea for absolution, as if each excuse were an attempt to say, "Let me exist without punishment." But to live constantly asking permission to be is the opposite of freedom and integrity. When you're always explaining, your inner compass goes haywire. You no longer know whether you decided something because you wanted it, or just so you wouldn't be misunderstood. You don't know if you kept quiet because silence felt right, or because you couldn't find a respectable enough explanation to speak. That's how the prison begins. An elegant prison with soft carpets and polite smiles. But a prison nonetheless. There, you live under another's gaze. You wake up and put on a character. Worse yet, you start to believe that character is you. Is it normal to explain yourself? You could say yes, it's normal, but normal can be tragic. It's normal to smother your discomfort for the sake of peace. It's normal to smile when you want to scream. It's normal to live constantly apologizing for being who you are. And that's precisely the normal that needs to be questioned. Once you start noticing this pattern in yourself, something shifts. You realize that your words are often not expression, but defense. Defense against judgment, abandonment, the disapproving look. You aren't speaking, you're trying to survive. Compulsive explanations are armor, but they don't protect, they paralyze. And the more you explain, the less you hear yourself, the less you feel, the less you are. Jung called it self-abandonment. It's when you've moved so far from your essence that you don't even remember how your inner voice sounded. The cruelest part? The world rewards this. People adore those who explain everything. Those who apologize for their sensitivity, justify their intensity, soften their boundaries with a smile. You become convenient. But at what price? At the price of your truth, your silence, your peace. That's why when you begin to be quiet, not out of evasiveness, but out of wholeness, the world gets awkward. People pull back, ask, "Are you okay?" As if your silence were an act of violence. It isn't. It's an act of rebirth, because when you stop explaining yourself, you return to belonging to yourself, and that changes everything. There's something you need to know. Has it happened to you that precisely when you most need to keep calm, your mind collapses? That loss of control is not only emotional, it's cognitive. It happens because most of us were trained to feel first and only then think, to react first and only then observe. The problem is structural. No one taught us to train the mind like a muscle. So every small frustration becomes an explosion, and each challenge, an inner defeat. But there's another way to work with yourself, a framework grounded in neuroscience, applied philosophy, and quiet mental techniques that rewire your reactivity and return the controls to you. We recorded a step-by-step video showing exactly how it works in real life. If you want to watch now, scan the code on screen or use the link in the description or pinned comment. The root of the need to explain yourself isn't in adulthood. It's a seed planted much earlier, back when your crying bothered someone, when your sadness was called exaggeration, when you learned that feeling is dangerous and being understood is a matter of survival. Childhood is the territory of the first emotional betrayals. They aren't loud or dramatic. They're small things, looks of disapproval, sharp words tossed over a shoulder, deafening silences. Stop whining. Don't make a scene. That's nothing to get worked up about. You're too sensitive. Have you heard such things? If yes, you know this wound. Jung understood this root deeply. For him, the psyche is shaped not only by what happened to us, but also by what we were not allowed to fully live. A childhood where feelings are punished teaches one clear lesson. Don't be fully yourself. A child who's told their anger is ugly learns to smile on the outside and burn within. Mocked for fear, they learn to perform bravery and feel ashamed of their instinct to protect themselves. When their pain is ignored or minimized, they conclude, they will be heard only if they are convincing, logical, justified. Thus, dependence on explanations is born. Justifying becomes a way to avoid punishment, to avoid being left, a bid to keep love close, even if that means mutating. This child grows up, becomes an adult, but carries inside an invisible, internalized judge whispering, explain yourself, or they'll leave. Be reasonable, or they'll reject you. Don't feel too much. Don't disturb too much. Don't be too much. Worse, it works. For a while you explain yourself, and people like you. You soften your feelings, and you're considered easy. You adapt, and the world applauds. But inside you wilt, as if every explanation killed a centimeter of your spontaneity, and every attempt to be understood took a bite out of your freedom. One day you wake up tired, not of the world, but of yourself. Tired of having stayed silent. Tired of rehearsing words just to avoid offending. Tired of being ashamed of your own feelings. The cruelest part, often those who most demanded explanations from you in childhood are the very people who wanted to love you. That creates an inner conflict. The love that should have been a home became an arena, and you learn that to be loved you must be convincing, as if love were a court where you're always on defense, always proving that your pain is legitimate, your silence has a reason, your presence has value. But what if I say, you no longer have to fight for that kind of love? This constant need to explain yourself isn't empathy. It's a symptom of emotional abandonment. No one should have to justify what they feel. You feel, that is enough. You exist, that is enough. But this clarity doesn't sprout on its own. It must be cultivated, rescued from the ruins of childhood. Where you were forced into silence, something broke. And now, perhaps for the first time, you can start to hear what that child wanted to say. They didn't want approval, they wanted holding. They didn't need rational understanding. They needed to be seen, felt, accepted, even when they are too much, odd, out of place. That holding begins now, with the silence you learn to endure without fear, with tears without explanations, with anger without guilt, with sadness without subtitles. This is the first gesture of reunion with the self, to allow your emotions to be what they are, without defense, without excuses, without censorship. Here the cycle begins to unwind. What used to be automatic, explaining, softening, justifying, starts to look absurd. You notice you're more whole when you don't try to be liked, more alive when you stop chasing the right interpretation, more authentic when you stop asking permission to exist. And in that moment, the quiet child within smiles, because at last they've been heard, and the one who heard them was you. Picture a stage. The lights come up, the curtain opens, and there you are. The hall is full, family, colleagues, lovers, strangers, everyone waiting for your performance. And without noticing, you begin to act. You smile when you'd rather be silent. You nod when everything inside screams no. You justify, you bend, you dim, just to preserve a harmony that was never yours. This is the life of someone who has lost the axis of their I. The polished, well-trained character is the ego trying to survive in a world where being yourself feels dangerous. Jung taught, the ego should be a bridge between inner and outer. But when a bridge lives only for external traffic, it forgets where it originated. The ego stops being an instrument and becomes a mask. The tragedy is that the mask gets applause. You become convenient, mature, reasonable, and something inside dies. Because every time you say yes, wanting to say no, the body knows. The soul contracts. The heart gives it away as a lump in the throat, a bone-deep fatigue, and anxiety without a name. With this repetition, the ego disconnects from the self. It's no longer a channel, but a puppet, jerked by invisible strings of other people's expectations. You stop knowing who you are because everything you think, feel, and choose passes through the filter. Will they understand? Will they like me? Will they reject me? This theater of approval is woven not from applause, but from fear. Fear of being truly seen. Fear of being rejected in full. Fear that if you show yourself without a mask, you'll be alone. And so you stay on stage, perform flawlessly, collect applause. But backstage, alone, you cry. The ego can be a star, but the self is the invisible director. And when the self realizes it's been forgotten, it starts sabotaging the show. Anxiety appears, insomnia, emptiness, the sense that life is passing but you aren't in it. Then you ask yourself, why am I so exhausted if everything seems fine? Why am I so lonely among people? Why am I so afraid to disappoint? These questions are the self's whisper, trying to dehypnotize you, to remind you that you came into the world not to be understood, but to be whole. Yet leaving this theater isn't easy. It feels like peeling off your skin. You will disappoint, you will lose applause, you will cause discomfort. You'll hear selfish, ungrateful, difficult. That's only because you're stopping the performance. And those who controlled you with conditional love realize their power is slipping. The ego that lived to please begins to doubt. Do I really have to be so convenient? What if my empathy was fear of rejection? What if my silence was not peace but fear of conflict? These doubts hurt, but they free. When the ego stops pretending, the self begins to speak, firmly and clearly, in a voice you may not have heard for years, but that's always been there, waiting for you to stop explaining and finally listen to yourself. And the curious thing, you gradually discover what no one told you. You don't have to convince anyone to be loved. You don't have to justify every emotion to be respected. You don't have to prove anything to deserve to exist. You only need to step off the stage, even if that means walking in the dark for a while, even if the hall empties, even if the silence scares you. It is precisely in that silence, away from the spotlights, that you meet the only presence that never left you, yourself. There is a silence that heals, a silence that destroys, and a third silence that sets boundaries. It doesn't announce itself, pound the table, or demand respect. It simply establishes itself. This silence is born when you stop explaining, not from pride or anger, but because you finally understand. You owe no one anything, neither justification for your existence nor arguments for your being. When this silence arrives, it's frightening, not to you who can finally breathe, but to those who fed on your doubts. As long as you were explaining, people knew how to bend you, which string to pluck to get a response. A question was enough, and you ran to justify yourself. Now with this silence, the game changes. There are no easy paths to your center, no emotional maneuvers that open your inner gates. You are no longer an open book. You are a sanctuary. For many, this is unbearable. Jung knew this. He said the process of individuation demands rupture, not because you're eager to break things, but because your wholeness becomes intolerable to those who only knew how to relate to your compliance. You start saying no, and you don't explain. You change your mind without providing arguments. You leave without writing emotional testaments to soothe someone's pain. And do you know what happens? The silence screams, not in you, in them. They ask, why are you like this? What did I do? Won't you even explain? And you just breathe, evenly, present, whole. Because you've realized, if someone sees you only when you explain yourself, they've never truly seen you. Silence becomes a revolution when it breaks the cycle of emotional manipulation, when it overturns the warped symmetry of relationships in which you were forced to justify what you feel, how you change, that you are. This silence reveals who was with you for closeness and who was there because they could control you. It's like turning off the music and realizing the dance made no sense anymore. Like switching on the light and seeing the place you smiled in was a decorated cell. And you understand, you're not losing people, you're losing roles. Along with them, the tacit contracts that kept you small. The revolution of silence is radical not because it destroys, but because it restructures, redraws your outline, and forces the world to meet you without script, without mask, without edits. There is a price. The silence will tempt you, pull you back, call you into the old script. At first, you almost give in. Your body trembles, your throat tightens, your mind screams, explain. You'll seem cold, heartless, distant, but you remain. And this remaining is sacred. Here inner authority is born, a dense core of I that no longer needs proof. Jung called it the psychological center. It's the point where the self stabilizes, not petrified, yet unyielding in what matters. And suddenly the silence stops being confrontation and becomes presence. You enter, and you no longer need many words. People feel it. They see someone who doesn't beg for understanding, doesn't bow to judgment, doesn't dance to expectation. And that evokes respect, real respect, not the kind based on fear, but the kind arising from the sense of wholeness. When you stop explaining yourself, the internal disintegration stops, and everything around is forced to reorganize. The world struggles with such silence because it breaks the rules of social exchange. It says, I don't need you to like it. I don't need you to understand. I simply am. To be at that level is a revolution. A revolution without noise, without placards, without speeches, just presence, silence, truth. Have you ever seen someone enter a room and, without a word, change the energy of the space? Not out of arrogance or imposed authority, but by a presence that doesn't need to announce itself. This is the power of one who has stopped explaining, of one who has found psychological wholeness, what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are without apologizing for it. You can't perform this wholeness. It isn't in the speech, it's in the gesture, the gaze, in the silence that says, I listen to myself first, and that is enough. Getting here isn't a miracle, it's excavation. A long, brave, often solitary road. It demands facing everything that taught you to live for others. Above all, restoring trust in yourself. Because the compulsive urge to explain is fueled not only by the fear of rejection, but also by the fear of being wrong about yourself, of doubting the validity of your feelings, of not believing your truth deserves a place even if no one likes it. So psychological wholeness is quiet but dense. It doesn't shout or impose, but it's like a deep root, invisible, yet it holds everything up. You begin to notice it in small things. When you say no without remorse, when you feel something inconvenient and don't rush to rationalize it, when you leave without needing excuses, when you trust your intuition, even without evidence, you no longer need to be understood because you understand yourself. And that resonates. Relationships change. The kinds of conversations you're willing to tolerate change. How others treat you changes. Because you've stopped being malleable and become someone who inhabits themselves. Jung said the psyche is a living organism. When there's imbalance, symptoms appear. When alignment comes, presence appears. The presence of someone who doesn't beg for attention, doesn't need applause, doesn't live in other people's interpretations, and it begins to radiate from you. People sense it and behave differently, not because you've become superior, but because you've become whole. There's something magnetic about a person who refuses to explain themselves, not as defense, but as a stance, as if saying, I no longer bend to expectations. I belong to who I am. Such wholeness is revolutionary. It turns off control games, dissolves bonds based on guilt, and opens a new kind of relationship between two whole people, not between lack and approval. But remember, wholeness isn't rigidity, it's flexibility with a root. The ability to listen to another without dissolving, to say, this doesn't resonate for me, without a long construction, to act gently without betraying yourself. You don't need to explain your boundaries, you hold them. You don't need to defend your feelings, you live in them. You don't need to convince anyone. You no longer trade your essence. And the stronger this stance, the less anxiety, the less need to control others' opinions, the less fear of being misunderstood. Because you've learned respect is born not from striving, but from presence, and presence from truth. Your truth, the kind that doesn't need subtitles, won't fit into a justification. It simply is. Perhaps the hardest part isn't to stop explaining, but to accept that you never needed to. You did not come into the world to be understood, but to be whole. When the need to persuade quiets down, what awakens isn't arrogance, it's sovereignty. A quiet return to the seat of your power, yourself. And I know this because I lived the opposite way. I bent for a long time to fit, edited myself to be liked, explained literally everything, until one of those days when the soul gets tired, I said nothing. And for the first time, I was truly heard. Sometimes silence is the only sound the world respects. If this message moved you, then perhaps, like me, you're tired of asking permission to be. So inhale, remain in the quiet, and belong to yourself. Oh, and don't forget to follow the link in the description or pinned comment. There's the full breakdown of the mental model that's helped many people stop reacting the old way and start responding with strength, clarity, and control. Thank you for being here, for not running from the truth, for walking with me in this pre-dawn whisper between sense and nonsense, where what we are lives when no one is watching. Now leave a comment with the explain away you're ready to release. Hit like if this challenged you. Subscribe. There are no promised answers here, only deep dives. And click the video on screen if you've got the nerve. But fair warning, after it, it'll be hard to keep hiding from yourself.